The humid air clung to Lynn's skin as she packed the last of her equipment into the weathered research jeep. After 6 grueling weeks in the dense rainforests of Brazil, the 32-year-old environmental researcher was ready to head home. The expedition had been a success. She'd collected enough plant samples to keep her lab busy for months, photographed several rare bird species, and even spotted a jaguar from a safe distance. Her research team had already departed 2 days earlier, but Lynn had stayed behind to document one final area before concluding the trip. "All set, Dr. Patel?" called out Roberto, the local guide who had been invaluable throughout their expedition. "Flight leaves in 4 hours. We should get moving." Lynn nodded, wiping beads of sweat from her forehead. "Just double-checking I haven't left anything behind." She glanced around the small wooden structure that had been their base camp. Her eyes fell on her journal, nearly filled with detailed observations and quick sketches. She tucked it securely into her backpack. This expedition marked her 5th year studying the biodiversity of tropical ecosystems and its response to climate change. The drive to the small regional airport was bumpy, the unpaved roads jarring every bone in her body. Lynn barely noticed, her mind already sorting through the data she'd collected and planning the analysis she'd begin once back in her lab. Roberto chatted about his family and asked about her plans upon returning home. First, the longest shower in human history, Lynn laughed. Then sleep in a real bed for about 12 hours straight. The flight home was long and uncomfortable, with a connection in Sao Paulo and another in New York before finally reaching her home city. By the time Lynn dragged herself through her apartment door, she was operating on autopilot. She dropped her bags in the hallway, managed a quick shower, and collapsed into bed, asleep before her head fully hit the pillow. The next morning, Lynn woke to sunlight streaming through her blinds. Her body ached from weeks of hiking through difficult terrain, but there was a deep satisfaction in having completed such a productive expedition. She unpacked methodically, separating items that needed washing from those that required special handling. The samples were carefully stored in her home refrigerator until she could take them to the university lab tomorrow. That evening, while preparing a simple dinner, her first home-cooked meal in weeks, Lynn felt an itch on her left forearm. She scratched it absently, her attention focused on chopping vegetables. Later, as she relaxed on her couch catching up on emails, she noticed a small red bump where she'd been itching. It looked exactly like a mosquito bite, slightly raised with a tiny red dot in the center. "Great souvenir from Brazil," she muttered, applying some anti-itch cream from her first aid kit. In her line of work, insect bites were practically part of the job description. She'd been religious about applying repellent throughout the expedition, but it was impossible to prevent every bite, especially in an environment teeming with insects. The next day, Lynn returned to her office at the university. Her colleagues greeted her warmly, eager to hear about her expedition. She spent the day organizing her notes and cataloging preliminary samples. The mosquito bite on her arm occasionally itched, but it was nothing more than a minor annoyance among the day's activities. "How was Brazil?" asked Dr. Chen, her department head, stopping by her office late in the afternoon. "The preliminary reports you sent were quite promising." "It exceeded expectations," Lynn replied enthusiastically. "We identified 3 plant species with potential medicinal properties that weren't on our target list. The locals have been using them for generations, but they've never been properly studied." They chatted about the expedition's highlights and the upcoming analysis phase. As they talked, Lynn absently scratched her arm again. "Souvenir?" Dr. Chen asked, nodding toward the bite. "Just a mosquito." "At least I hope it was just a mosquito," Lynn joked. "Could have been any one of the thousands of biting insects we encountered." Over the next few days, Lynn settled back into her routine. Mornings in the lab analyzing samples, afternoons writing up observations and findings, and evenings catching up with friends she hadn't seen in weeks. The mosquito bite remained, not healing as quickly as she expected, but it wasn't particularly painful or concerning. By the end of the week, however, Lynn noticed that instead of fading, the bite seemed to be changing. The area around it had become slightly swollen, and the center appeared darker than before. When she pressed on it gently, she felt a dull throb that hadn't been there initially. Still, Bug bites could take time to heal, and her skin often reacted strongly to insect bites. On Sunday evening, while video chatting with her parents, Lynn's mother noticed her scratching. "You keep touching your arm, honey. Is something wrong?" her mother asked, her face showing concern even through the pixelated connection. "It's nothing, Mom, just a bug bite from the trip that's taking its time to heal." "Have you put anything on it?" "Your aunt had a terrible reaction to a bite last summer, ended up needing antibiotics. I've been using that cream you always packed in my camp kits," Lynn assured her. "It's probably just taking longer to heal because I'm run down from the trip." That night, as Lynn was getting ready for bed, she examined the bite more carefully. The surrounding skin had a slight reddish tinge that spread about an inch from the center. When she looked very closely, she thought the dark spot in the middle almost looked like a tiny hole. A strange thought flitted through her mind. What if it wasn't actually a mosquito bite? She'd heard stories from more experienced researchers about various parasites and insect larvae that could burrow under human skin. "Don't be ridiculous," she told herself aloud, applying more anti-itch cream before turning off the light. "You're letting your imagination run wild." But as she drifted off to sleep, Lynn couldn't shake a growing feeling of unease. In her half-dreaming state, she could have sworn she felt something move beneath her skin, right where the bite was. She jerked awake, heart pounding, and turned on the lamp beside her bed. The bite looked exactly the same as before. Just a bug. Bite. Nothing moving. Nothing alive. Lynn turned off the light again and pulled the covers up to her chin, telling herself she was being silly. But she couldn't help wondering, what if it wasn't just a mosquito bite after all? Morning came too quickly, and Lynn dragged herself out of bed after a restless night. She examined her arm in the bathroom mirror under the harsh fluorescent light. The bite definitely looked different than it had yesterday. The redness had spread, slightly, and the center appeared darker, almost like a tiny scab was forming. She gently pressed around the edges and winced at the unexpected tenderness. "It's just an infected bite," she muttered to herself as she got ready for work. "Happens, all the time." She rummaged through her medicine cabinet and found some antibiotic ointment past its expiration date. Better than nothing, she thought, applying a small dab before covering it with a bandage. At the university lab, Lynn tried to focus on cataloging the plant samples she'd brought back from Brazil. The work was meticulous and required her complete attention, but she found herself repeatedly distracted by the dull throbbing in her arm. During her lunch break, she peeled back the bandage to check on the bite. The redness had spread further, and the center now looked like a small dark hole about the size of a pinhead. Her office mate Raj glanced over at her arm. "That doesn't look like a normal mosquito bite." "I know," Lynn admitted, carefully replacing the bandage. "It's probably just infected. I'll pick up some stronger antibiotic cream on the way home." "My cousin got a weird bite like that after hiking in Costa Rica," Raj said, leaning closer to examine it. "Turned out to be some kind of burrowing insect. Had to get it removed at the doctor's office." Lynn tried to laugh off his comment, but a flutter of anxiety rose in her chest. "I'm sure it's nothing that dramatic. Probably just an ordinary infection." Throughout the afternoon, Lynn found it increasingly difficult to concentrate. The throbbing had intensified, sending occasional sharp pains up her arm. During a department meeting, she caught herself zoning out multiple times as Dr. Chen discussed upcoming grant proposals. When the meeting ended, Dr. Chen asked her to stay behind. "Are you feeling all right, Lynn? You seem distracted today." "I'm fine," she assured him. "Just a bit tired from the trip still. Jet lag, you know." "Take it easy this week," he advised. "The samples have waited this long in the forest. They can wait another day or two for analysis." That evening, Lynn stopped at a pharmacy on her way home and purchased stronger antibiotic cream and fresh bandages. The pharmacist recommended she see a doctor if the bite didn't improve within 48 hours. Lynn nodded politely but wasn't particularly concerned yet. In her years of fieldwork, she'd dealt with countless insect bites, scrapes, and minor infections. This one was just being stubborn. At home, Lynn heated up leftover takeout for dinner and settled on her couch with her laptop to review some of the photos she'd taken during the expedition. As she scrolled through images of dense foliage and colorful birds, her arm began to throb more intensely. She set the laptop aside and removed the bandage to check on the bite again. The area around it was now undeniably swollen, with a red circle about the size of a quarter surrounding the dark center. When she touched it gently, she felt something unusual, almost like there was a small hard lump beneath the skin. A chill ran down her spine as she remembered what Raj had said about his cousin's experience in Costa Rica. "Don't be ridiculous," she told herself firmly. "It's just inflammation from the infection." Lynn cleaned the area carefully and applied the new antibiotic cream before covering it with a fresh bandage. She took some over-the-counter pain relievers and tried to distract herself by calling her friend Priya to catch up. "You sound off," Priya said after a few minutes of conversation. "Everything okay?" "Just tired," Lynn replied, not wanting to make a big deal about a bug bite. Still recovering from 6 weeks of sleeping in a hammock and battling the elements. That night, Lynn tossed and turned, unable to find a comfortable position. The bite seemed to throb in rhythm with her heartbeat, and she couldn't stop thinking about what might be causing it. Around 2 a.m., half asleep and irritable from the pain, she pulled off the bandage and shined her phone's flashlight directly on the bite. The dark center now clearly looked like a small hole, and the skin around it was stretched tight from swelling. As she stared at it, fighting the fog of sleepiness, she could have sworn she saw the hole expand and contract ever so slightly, as if something inside was breathing. Lynn jerked fully awake, heart racing. Had she actually seen movement, or was her tired mind playing tricks on her? She turned on her bedside lamp and examined the bite again, but it looked static now, just an inflamed patch of skin with a dark spot in the middle. Still, she couldn't shake the disturbing image from her mind. Sleep was impossible after that. Lynn spent the remainder of the night researching parasitic insects on her laptop, scrolling through medical websites and scientific journals. She found information about various flies and other insects that could lay eggs in human skin, allowing their larvae to develop underneath. The images made her stomach turn, but they also looked disturbingly similar to what was happening on her arm. Morning. Lynn had convinced herself that she needed medical attention. The bite had continued to worsen overnight, and the surrounding area now felt hot to the touch, a clear sign of infection. She called her doctor's office as soon as they opened, but was told the earliest available appointment was in 3 days. "Just returned from Brazil, and I have what might be a parasitic infection," Lynn explained, trying to keep her voice calm. "It's getting worse quite rapidly." The receptionist put her on hold briefly, then returned with better news. "Dr. Nguyen had a cancellation. She can see you at 11:30 this morning if you can make it." "I'll be there," Lynn said, relief washing over her. At work, Lynn informed Dr. Chen that she needed to leave for a medical appointment. He took one look at her pale face and the way she was cradling her arm and nodded immediately. "Take the whole day if you need to," he said. "You look exhausted." The hours until her appointment crawled by. Lynn tried to distract herself with work, but her mind kept returning to the disturbing possibilities. What if something was actually living inside her arm? The thought made her skin crawl. During a moment of calm rationality, she told herself she was overreacting. It was probably just an infected bite that needed some prescription antibiotics. But then she would feel that strange throbbing sensation again, and her imagination would run wild with horrifying scenarios. By the time Lynn sat in the doctor's waiting room, her arm was burning with pain and she felt slightly feverish. She flipped absently through a magazine, unable to focus on the words or images. Her mind kept replaying the moment from last night when she thought she'd seen the hole in her arm move. Had it really happened, or had she dreamed it in her exhausted state? A nurse called her name and Lynn followed her to an examination room, her heart pounding with a mixture of anxiety and anticipation. Whatever was happening with this mosquito bite, she would finally get some answers. She just hoped they weren't the answers she was most afraid of. The examination room felt too cold, and Lynn wrapped her arms around herself while waiting for Dr. Nguyen. Her infected arm throbbed in protest at being moved. The walls were lined with educational posters about common ailments and preventative care. Lynn found herself staring at one that showed the life cycle of various disease-carrying mosquitoes, wondering if one of these insects was responsible for her current situation. The door opened and Dr. Nguyen walked in, scanning Lynn's chart. She was a petite woman with kind eyes and an efficient manner that Lynn had always appreciated during previous visits. "So, you've been to Brazil recently?" Dr. Nguyen asked, setting the chart down and washing her hands thoroughly at the small sink. "Yes, a research expedition. 6 weeks in the rainforest." Lynn rolled up her sleeve to reveal the bandaged area. "I noticed this about a week after I got back. It started like a mosquito bite, but it's gotten worse instead of better." Dr. Nguyen put on gloves and carefully removed the bandage. Her expression remained neutral, but Lynn noticed a slight furrow in her brow as she examined the inflamed area. "How long has it had this appearance? With the dark center?" "It's been getting progressively worse for about 4 days," Lynn explained. "At first it was just red and itchy like a normal bite. Then it developed this dark spot in the middle and started to hurt. Now it throbs constantly." The doctor gently pressed around the edges of the swollen area, making Lynn wince. "Sorry about that. Is it tender all around or mainly in the center?" "Mainly in the center, but the whole area is getting more sensitive." Dr. Nguyen reached for a magnifying glass from a drawer and held it over the wound, examining it more closely. Lynn tried to read her expression but couldn't tell what the doctor was thinking. "Have you noticed anything unusual about it? Any discharge or changes in the appearance of the center?" Lynn hesitated, feeling suddenly embarrassed about what she was about to say. "Last night I thought I saw the hole in the center move slightly, like something was, I don't know, breathing in there." She gave a nervous laugh. "I was really tired, though. It was probably just my imagination." Dr. Nguyen didn't laugh or dismiss her observation. Instead, she looked even more intently at the wound through the magnifying glass. After a moment, she set it down and looked directly at Lynn. "I believe what you're experiencing is something called cutaneous myiasis," she said calmly. "It's a condition where fly larvae develop under the skin." Lynn stared at her, the words taking a moment to register fully. "You mean, there's something living in my arm?" The doctor nodded, her expression serious but reassuring. "Based on your recent travel history and the appearance of the lesion, I suspect it's a human botfly larva. They're common in parts of Central and South America." The room seemed to tilt slightly as Lynn processed this information. All those hours researching parasitic insects last night, and she'd still managed to convince herself that her situation couldn't possibly be that extreme. Yet here was Dr. Nguyen, calmly confirming her worst fears. How would that even happen?" Lynn asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Botflies have an interesting life cycle," Dr. Nguyen explained, pulling up a chair to sit across from Lynn. "They often capture mosquitoes or other biting insects and attach their eggs to them. When the mosquito bites a human, the warmth triggers the eggs to hatch and the larvae enter through the bite wound or hair follicles. Then they begin to develop under the skin." Lynn felt her stomach lurch. "And that's what's happening to me? There's a larva growing in my arm right now?" "I believe so. The breathing hole you observed is a characteristic sign. The larva creates a small opening to the outside air. That's the dark spot in the center. They need to breathe just like any living organism." Lynn looked down at her arm, seeing the inflamed bump with entirely new eyes. It wasn't just an infection. It was a living creature using her body as an incubator. The thought made her skin crawl, and she had to fight the urge to scratch frantically at the site as if she could somehow claw the intruder out herself. "How do we get rid of it?" she asked, struggling to keep her voice steady. "There are several approaches we can take," Dr. Nguyen said. "The traditional method is to cut off the larva's air supply, which forces it to emerge partially so it can be extracted. We can use petroleum jelly or a similar substance to cover the breathing hole." "And that works?" Lynn couldn't keep the skepticism from her voice. "It's effective, but it takes time, sometimes hours. There are also surgical options, but those carry risks because the larva has developed structures like small spines that anchor it in the tissue. Incomplete removal can lead to secondary infections." Lynn closed her eyes briefly, trying to process all this information without panicking. When she opened them again, she asked, "What do you recommend?" "Given the location and the stage of development, I estimate it's been there for at least 10 days. I suggest we try the occlusion method first. It's less invasive and usually successful." Lynn nodded, trying to appear calmer than she felt. "Okay, let's do that." Dr. Nguyen prepared the supplies: thick petroleum jelly, medical tape, and gauze. She explained each step as she worked, applying a generous amount of jelly directly over the breathing hole and covering it with a secure dressing. "This will take some time," she said. "The larva will begin to feel oxygen deprived and should start moving toward the surface within an hour or two. When that happens, I'll need to be ready to extract it. In the meantime, I'd like to get some antibiotics started as a precaution." Lynn nodded again, numb with the reality of her situation. Dr. Nguyen arranged for Lynn to stay in the examination room, promising to check on her frequently. A nurse came in to start an IV with antibiotics, and Lynn was left alone with her thoughts and the increasingly uncomfortable sensation in her arm. Time passed excruciatingly slowly. Lynn tried to distract herself by answering emails on her phone, but she couldn't focus. Her mind kept returning to the fact that a parasitic insect larva was living inside her body. Every twinge or throb from her arm made her tense up, wondering if the creature was moving in response to its dwindling oxygen supply. After about 40 minutes, Lynn felt something different, a distinct squirming sensation beneath her skin that was impossible to dismiss as imagination. It was subtle at first, then more pronounced, making her gasp and press the call button for the nurse. Dr. Nguyen returned quickly, accompanied by a nurse carrying a tray of instruments. The doctor removed the dressing carefully and examined the site. "It's working," she confirmed. "I can see movement. The larva is trying to reposition itself to get more air." Lynn couldn't bring herself to look. The thought of actually seeing the creature emerging from her skin was too much to bear. She turned her head away and gripped the edge of the examination table with her good hand. "You're doing great," Dr. Nguyen assured her. "Just try to stay still. This is the most difficult part, but we're almost there." Minutes passed, each feeling like an eternity. The squirming sensation intensified, and Lynn bit her lip to keep from crying out. It wasn't exactly painful, but the awareness of what was happening made it almost unbearable. "I can see it," the doctor said, her voice calm but focused. "It's partially emerged. I'm going to try to extract it now with these forceps. You might feel some pressure, but try not to move." Lynn held her breath, eyes squeezed shut, as she felt a tugging sensation in her arm. Then came a moment of sharp, pulling pain that made her gasp, and suddenly it was over. "Got it," Dr. Nguyen announced, her voice triumphant. Despite her revulsion, Lynn couldn't resist turning to look. There, held carefully in the doctor's forceps, was a pale, squirming creature about the size of her smallest fingernail. It had a segmented body and what looked like tiny spines around its edges. Lynn stared at it in horrified fascination, unable to believe that this alien-looking thing had been living inside her arm for days. "Would you like to see it?" Dr. Nguyen asked, holding the forceps with the squirming larva. She spoke without judgment, understanding that some patients were curious, despite their disgust. Lynn hesitated, then nodded. Revulsion fought with scientific curiosity. The researcher in her couldn't help but want to observe this creature that had been living inside her body. Dr. Nguyen held the forceps closer, allowing Lynn to see the pale, segmented organism. It was about the size of a small bean, with a tapered body and tiny backward-facing spines that glinted under the examination room lights. "Those spines are why we couldn't just pull it out directly," the doctor explained. "They act as anchors in the tissue. That's why we had to coax it to come out partially on its own." Lynn stared at the creature, feeling a complex mix of emotions: disgust, fascination, and an odd sense of relief now that it was no longer inside her. "What happens to it now?" she asked. "We'll preserve it for laboratory analysis," Dr. Nguyen said. "It helps us track which species are prevalent in different regions. Would you mind if we use it for teaching purposes? Cases like this aren't common here, and it's valuable for medical students to see real examples. Lynn nodded, her scientific mind appreciating the educational value despite the personal nature of the experience. Of course, at least something good can come from this whole ordeal. The nurse took the specimen away while Dr. Nguyen turned her attention to treating the wound left behind. She cleaned it thoroughly, applied antibiotic ointment, and dressed it with fresh gauze. There will be a small hole for a while as this heals, she explained. It's important to keep it clean and continue the antibiotics to prevent any secondary infection. The larva created a pocket in your tissue that needs to close from the bottom up. Lynn listened carefully to the aftercare instructions, trying to focus on the practical aspects rather than dwelling on what had just happened. The doctor prescribed oral antibiotics and pain medication, then scheduled a follow-up appointment for the following week. You might experience some drainage from the wound for a few days, Dr. Nguyen warned. That's normal as your body heals, but if you notice increasing redness, warmth, or if you develop a fever, call immediately. Lynn nodded, suddenly feeling exhausted. The anxiety and stress of the past few days, combined with the emotional impact of the extraction, had drained her completely. Thank you for taking this seriously, she said. I was starting to think I was imagining things. Trust your instincts, the doctor replied with a gentle smile, especially after traveling to regions with different endemic parasites. Your early attention to this likely prevented a more serious infection. As Lynn prepared to leave, Dr. Nguyen handed her a small pamphlet about parasitic infections associated with travel. You might want to share this with your research colleagues. Prevention is always better than treatment. Outside the clinic, Lynn sat in her car for several minutes, not yet ready to drive. The reality of what had just happened washed over her, in waves. A living creature had been growing inside her body, feeding on her tissues, breathing through a hole it had created in her skin. The thought made her shudder. She texted Raj a brief update. You were right. It wasn't just an infected bite. Tell you more tomorrow. His response came immediately. OMG, are you okay? Need anything? Lynn smiled weakly at his concern. Just heading home to rest. We'll bring disgusting photos tomorrow for those with strong stomachs. At home, Lynn took her first dose of antibiotics and settled onto her couch with a cup of tea. She should eat something, but the thought of food made her stomach turn. Instead, she pulled up her laptop and began researching human botflies more thoroughly, now that she knew exactly what she was dealing with. The scientific name was Dermatobia hominis. The female flies capture other insects, like mosquitoes, and attach their eggs to them. When the carrier lands on a warm-blooded host, the eggs quickly hatch and the larvae burrow into the skin. There they grow for 6 to 8 weeks before emerging, falling to the ground and pupating into adult flies. 6 to 8 weeks? Lynn murmured, horrified at the thought of how large the larva might have grown if left undisturbed. The images online showed mature larvae that were almost an inch long. She closed the laptop, deciding she'd had enough nightmare fuel for one day. That night, as Lynn prepared for bed, she found herself repeatedly checking the bandage on her arm, half afraid that somehow another parasite might be lurking elsewhere in her body. Logically, she knew this was unlikely, but the experience had left her feeling vulnerable in a way she'd never experienced before. She took the prescribed pain medication and tried to sleep, but her dreams were filled with crawling sensations and tiny creatures burrowing under her skin. She woke several times during the night, heart pounding, her hand immediately going to the bandage on her arm to reassure herself that it was still secure. Morning brought a clearer perspective. In the shower, Lynn was careful to keep the bandage dry, following Dr. Nguyen's instructions precisely. The wound throbbed dully, but it was a clean pain, the kind that signaled healing rather than infection. She dressed carefully, choosing a loose-sleeved shirt that wouldn't rub against the bandage. Before heading to work, she called Dr. Chen to update him on her situation. A botfly larva? He repeated, sounding both concerned and intrigued. Are you sure you should be coming in today? You could take some time to recover. I'd rather keep busy, Lynn admitted. Sitting at home just gives me too much time to think about it. At the lab, Lynn became something of a celebrity. Word had spread quickly, thanks no doubt to Raj, and colleagues from other departments found excuses to stop by her office. Some were genuinely concerned about her well-being, while others barely disguised their morbid curiosity. "Did they let you keep it?" asked one entomologist from the third floor, his eyes bright with interest. "No, they're preserving it for research," Lynn replied, slightly amused by his disappointment. "But you took photos, right?" Raj asked. "You promised disgusting photos." Lynn rolled her eyes but pulled out her phone. "Dr. Nguyen took one right after extraction. She sent it to me for my records." She passed the phone to Raj, who stared at the image with a mixture of disgust and fascination before passing it around to the small crowd that had gathered. "That was living in your arm," one of the graduate students said, her face pale. "I'm never going to the rainforest. Ever." "It's extremely rare," Lynn assured her, though part of her was enjoying the dramatic reaction her experience was generating. After the genuine horror she'd felt, there was something cathartic about sharing it with others who could appreciate the scientific aspects while still acknowledging how disturbing it was. By lunchtime, Lynn had told the story so many times that it was beginning to feel almost routine, a strange adventure rather than a personal trauma. Dr. Chen insisted on taking her to lunch, using the opportunity to discuss additional health precautions for future field expeditions. "We should review our protocols," he suggested. "Perhaps more frequent application of insect repellent, especially in the evenings when many flying insects are most active." Lynn nodded, grateful for his practical approach. "And maybe a more thorough health check immediately upon return, not waiting for symptoms to develop." As they walked back to the department, Dr. Chen glanced at her bandaged arm. "Does it still hurt?" "Less than before," Lynn admitted. "But the weirdest part is the psychological effect. I keep feeling phantom sensations all over my body, imagining things crawling under my skin. That's a normal response to trauma," he said gently. "It will fade with time. The mind needs to process these kinds of experiences." Lynn hoped he was right. For now, she was grateful for the distraction of work, for colleagues who understood both the scientific fascination and personal horror of what she'd experienced, and for modern medicine that had removed the unwelcome visitor from her body before it could grow any larger. 3 weeks had passed since the extraction. Lynn sat at her desk, absently touching the small scar on her arm where the botfly larva had been removed. It had healed well, leaving just a tiny indentation in her skin, a permanent souvenir from her Brazilian expedition. The follow-up appointment with Dr. Nguyen had gone smoothly. The wound was healing properly with no signs of infection, and the antibiotics had done their job. Still, Lynn couldn't shake the psychological impact of the experience. She found herself checking her skin more carefully each day, and her enthusiasm for future fieldwork had been tempered by a new awareness of the unseen dangers lurking in the environments she studied. Today, she was preparing for a presentation to the entire biology department about her research findings from Brazil. Dr. Chen had suggested she add a brief section about her personal experience with the botfly, both as a cautionary tale for other researchers and as an interesting real-world connection to the parasitic relationships she studied in plants. "You don't have to include it if you're uncomfortable," he had told her, "but it might be valuable for others to hear firsthand about these risks." Lynn had agreed, recognizing that her experience, though unpleasant, had educational value. She added a few slides to her presentation, including a censored version of the photo Dr. Nguyen had taken. It was scientific rather than sensationalistic, exactly the approach she wanted to take. As she reviewed her presentation one final time, Raj knocked on her office door. "Ready for your big moment?" he asked, leaning against the doorframe. "Word has spread about your special guest appearance. I think half the department is coming just to hear about your little friend." Lynn rolled her eyes. "Great. I've become the department's horror story. More like a living legend," Raj corrected with a grin. "Not everyone can say they've provided room and board to an Amazonian parasite and lived to tell the tale." Despite her lingering discomfort with the memory, Lynn had to smile. Raj's humor had been one of the things that helped her process the experience. His ability to see the absurd side of the situation without diminishing its seriousness had been strangely comforting. The lecture hall was indeed packed when Lynn arrived. She spotted familiar faces from other departments and even a few medical students who had likely heard about her case from Dr. Nguyen. The attention made her slightly nervous, but as a researcher, she was used to presenting her findings. Her talk began with the scientific data she'd collected: plant samples with potential medicinal properties, observations about changing biodiversity patterns, and the impact of climate variations on the rainforest ecosystem. The audience was attentive, but predictably perked up when she reached the slides about her personal encounter. "While in Brazil, I unknowingly brought back an additional specimen," she said, clicking to the next slide that showed a scientific illustration of the human botfly life cycle. "Not in my collection bags, but under my skin." She described the experience clinically at first, explaining the biology of the botfly and its unusual reproductive strategy. Then, sensing that the audience wanted more than just scientific facts, she allowed herself to share the human side of the story. The gradual realization that something was wrong, the disturbing moment when she thought she saw movement, and the horror mixed with fascination when the larva was finally extracted. The most surprising aspect wasn't the physical experience, she admitted, but the psychological impact. "Even now, weeks later, I sometimes wake up convinced I can feel something moving under my skin. It's given me a new perspective on the invasive nature of parasitic relationships, one that goes beyond academic understanding." The questions afterward were numerous and engaged. Students wanted to know about prevention strategies. Other researchers shared similar stories from their fieldwork. And one entomology professor asked detailed questions about the specific species and its distribution patterns. After the presentation, Dr. Chen approached her with a visitor, a woman Lynn didn't recognize. "Excellent presentation," Dr. Chen said warmly. "Lynn, I'd like you to meet Dr. Patel from the Tropical Disease Research Center. She was very interested in your experience." Dr. Patel shook Lynn's hand enthusiastically. "Fascinating case. We've been tracking various parasitic infections brought back by travelers and researchers. Would you be interested in participating in a study we're conducting? We're developing better preventative guidelines for people working in high-risk areas." Lynn was intrigued. What would that involve? Initially, just an interview about your experience and the preventative measures you took, or wish you had taken. Later, possibly reviewing draft guidelines and providing feedback from a field researcher's perspective. The idea appealed to Lynn immediately. "I'd be happy to help. If my experience can prevent someone else from going through the same thing, that would give it some purpose." They exchanged contact information, and Dr. Patel promised to email her more details about the study. As she left, Lynn felt a sense of unexpected purpose emerging from her ordeal. Perhaps this was how she could take back control of the narrative, by transforming her experience into knowledge that could help others. That evening, Lynn began writing detailed notes about her experience, not just the clinical aspects, but the emotional journey as well. She described the initial dismissal of the symptoms, the growing anxiety as she realized something was wrong, and the strange mix of horror and relief when the diagnosis was confirmed. She wanted to capture every aspect while the memories were still fresh. As she wrote, she realized that her perspective on her work had shifted subtly. She had always approached her research with scientific detachment, seeing herself as an observer of natural systems rather than a participant in them. Now she understood on a visceral level that humans were not separate from the ecosystems they studied. They were part of them, vulnerable to the same forces and relationships they documented in other species. Over the following months, Lynn worked with Dr. Patel on developing improved health protocols for researchers working in tropical environments. Their collaboration resulted in a comprehensive guide that was adopted by several universities and research institutions. Lynn's detailed account of her experience, along with practical prevention strategies, formed the core of a case study that was used in training programs for field researchers. A year after her encounter with the botfly, Lynn returned to Brazil for another research expedition. This time, she was armed not only with stronger insect repellents and protective clothing, but with a deeper respect for the complex and sometimes hazardous relationships within the ecosystem she studied. On her office desk back home, Lynn kept a small resin cube containing the preserved botfly larva that Dr. Nguyen had given her after its analysis was complete. It served as a conversation starter, a teaching tool, and a personal reminder of her unwitting role in a natural life cycle that had been occurring long before humans existed and would continue long after. When new graduate students joined the department, they inevitably heard whispered versions of Dr. Lynn's botfly story. Some of the details became exaggerated in retelling. The larva grew larger with each version and the extraction became more dramatic. Lynn didn't mind. If the embellished stories made students more careful about protecting themselves during fieldwork, the minor inaccuracies were a small price to pay. The tiny scar on her arm had faded to a barely noticeable mark, but the experience had left an indelible impression on Lynn's approach to her work. She now understood that true knowledge came not just from observation and analysis, but sometimes through unwelcome personal experiences that forced you to see familiar subjects from entirely new perspectives.